Well, there's a whole recording situation happening. So I need to be here so all the technology works. So normally I'd want to be closer in with the group, but I have to kind of stay back here. Well, welcome, good evening. Thanks for making time and space in your evening, in your week for this conversation. Several of you have been a part of this complexity series. And so what we're doing each time is opening with the same exercise. So as you're able, please place both feet on the ground, one hand on your belly, one hand on your chest. Just notice your breathing. You don't have to change it. You don't have to breathe deeper or faster. Reflect for a moment. What are my body, heart, and mind telling me right now? Is there a deeper need underneath what my body, heart, and mind are telling me right now? What words describe my needs in this moment and in this context? And then I always close with, what are my goals for participation this evening? What are my goals for participation this evening? And with your next breath, you can return your attention to the room. So we get to spend this evening talking about LGBTQ plus justice, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, two-spirit, and more. Part of what I want to do is thread our work of complexity into a conversation about gender and sexuality. Sometimes it's easy to run toward or embrace or cling to the locations of justice or the locations of identity where we've experienced the most targeting, where we've experienced the most hardship, where we've experienced the most marginalization. Sometimes we run toward or cling to or stay focused on the aspects of identity and justice where we feel we have the most family or kin or friends who've experienced the most injustice. Sometimes because of how policy issues have been presented to us through news and media, we feel closer to or more connected to one aspect of identity or justice. And while the emphasis and the focus tonight is gender and sexuality, we're not going to talk about race and white supremacy. So if you're hoping for a breather, if you were hoping for a break from the conversation on white supremacy, tonight's not that. Because the project of white supremacy in the US as it exists would have us believe that conversations of racial justice and gender justice and LGBTQ justice and economic justice are separate and that they're neat and that they're tidy. And now the experience of racism is particular, and the experiences of homophobia and transphobia and biphobia are particular. And the experience of class inequality is particular. But the way we get talked to around policy issues, the way conversations often play out is that, one, there aren't some of us who don't live at the intersection of those injustices. I am Latino and queer. I can't parse those things, right? Some of us are women or femme presenting and queer. Some of us live at intersections that we're unable to break apart as we experience our experience. So all through the series, we'll continue to bring in multiple layers of experience while we give emphasis and attention to particular aspects of identity. My business partner, Trina, is fond of saying, well, self-awareness never hurt anyone. Might be hard, but it's often very useful. And so we begin with a little bit of internal reflection and then some sharing. I want you to spend a few moments with these questions. How do you describe your commitment to lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and more justice? How would you describe that for yourself? Whatever words come to you, whatever phrases come to you. Doesn't have to be particularly eloquent or fancy. Just how would you describe that? What about this is important to me in the context of church and spiritual practice? So I say this is why I care about LGBTQ plus justice. And within that, what's important about being in a church community that cares about queer and trans justice? What's important about a spiritual practice that advances LGBTQ plus justice? For you, what is and what is not work toward LGBTQ plus justice? If you were to say, like, there's things that fall inside of and things that fall outside of, or something that works against that framework of justice you have. What have been your patterns of showing your commitments to LGBTQ plus justice? For some of you, it might be, well, I am. So therefore, my answers. And for some of you, it may be, I'm coming to new awareness. It might be, I've worked hard to be an ally or an accomplice. When I think about some of my answers, I think about my early activism and my mentors really helping me think about the fact that as a cis male who presents moderately masculine, there's ally and accomplice work I need to do. So my early activism was about coming out and finding myself, but also understanding how I'm complicit in transphobia and misogyny. So for you, what's your framework around LGBTQ plus justice? Spend a few quiet moments with these questions. You don't have to have lengthy or full or complete answers to all of them. And in a few moments, I'll ask you to share with your table, but for now, a few quiet moments. Going to bring your attention back. So if you're the person speaking, go ahead and finish your thought. So why don't we begin here? There's a lot of ways to begin a conversation about gender and sexuality, about queer and trans identity, around LGBTQ justice. And this felt important. I have a rule, no throwaway icebreakers. So we're never going to do favorite color or what's the most interesting thing you ate last week when you're with me. Those sometimes have their purpose, but the no throwaway icebreakers rule really comes from a place of trying to think about what conversation, what reflection, what kind of activity might create an opening. And when I think about a community like a church, there can be ways that we move around, assuming that because we go here and we belong together and we go together, that the people at my table or the people who are participating in Sunday service or the folks that I'm in different ministries with are operating from the same definition of what social justice is and how it should operate at church. And so we invite that conversation because most of the time in communities of progress, We're hard on each other because we disappoint each other a lot, because we assume because of proximity that we have the same analysis. And proximity and analysis couldn't be farther from each other. Our work is to build shared analysis because we are proximate, because we believe we go together. So the invitation isn't to rest on, well, we're a progressive community, therefore we must be embodying appropriately, effectively, responsibly, righteously, however you think about it, LGBTQ justice. But I would say because we're a progressive community, that the nature of who you are demands that you're in principled wrestle and struggle about what you mean and the standards to which you're holding each other and the expectations that you have. Because if you just ride on, well, we're proximate, so we must share analysis, you will deeply disappoint each other and at best be confusing to one another. Like, wait, I thought we went together. You're really acting or thinking or talking in a way that I'm finding peculiar, surprising, hurtful. It's creating distance. So we start here because we need to be practiced at listening to people who when we came in, assumed we go together. And maybe some of you don't know each other. Maybe some of you are like, do I go here? Do we go together? But when we answer these questions together, we can start to say, okay, is it okay to have disparate perspective and analysis? When do we want or welcome disparate perspective or analysis? When is it important that we're in agreement? When is it important that we disagree but back each other up? So questions like this, when we're trying to engage of any conversation of justice, can be helpful practices. So borrow these from me, use them in all of your different work that you do here at church and all the different ways that you engage. Use questions like this, especially when you're in groups that are trying to decide things. You can say, hold on a second, I don't know if we have shared meaning. Let's try to answer some of these questions and see where our analysis overlaps. The stakes are a little lower for some of us in the room tonight because we're not deciding anything. So it's not important that you come to absolute agreement tonight. I'm going to teach something that I think I know some of you in the room could teach a version of. And because shared meaning is really important, it's important to me that we teach it and we engage it together. This is a framework that I learned like 18 years ago from the University of Minnesota's Transgender Commission. So the work that the Trans Commission was doing at the time really helped me as a student organizer. I was working across the state to organize LGBT and allied students to build like student leadership for progressive campus policy. And part of our work was to train student affairs officials. So at the time, it was not common to share pronouns. At the time, it was not common to have all gender restrooms. At the time, it was not common for many universities to provide domestic partner benefits. At the time, many of the women's sectors didn't have an expansive definition of who a woman could be, and so therefore were falling short in serving students. That was 18 years ago, it wasn't very long ago. And so our job was to build student power and then train predominantly straight and cisgender student affairs folks. And this framework really helped us unpack the distinctions between gender, sexuality, and sex. Part of the challenge with a conversation about gender and sexuality, or part of the challenge of the assumptions that we make, is there's a lot of words, there's a lot of language, and we're kind of jamming it all together. So I'm going to teach you this, And last week, like I said, hey, my expectation isn't that you will be able to analyze a public policy through the lens of intersectionality. My expectation is not that you will be able to reteach this framework after this evening if it's new to you. But what I just want to do is help us get closer to the truth that we all have gender, we all have sexuality, and we all have biological sex. And some of those things matter differently at different times in different contexts. And for some of us, how we experience those things has been on the move over the arc of our lifetime. And for some of us, those things stay fairly static over the course of our lifetime. Yeah, that's my preamble. So let's get into it. So when we talk about gender, oh, this was the other thing I wanted to say. Part of why we use this framework and part of why we start with we all have gender, we all have sexuality, is oftentimes what happens is when we talk about LGBTQ plus justice, we think primarily about individual acts of welcome for LGBT people, or when we talk about gender and sexuality, we think, well, the injustices queer people face or the misogyny that women face. So what we do in conversations around gender and sexuality is we actually exacerbate otherness. We say the conversation about gender and sexuality is for women, it's for trans people, it's for queer people, rather than saying we all are in a gendered experience and the current constructions of gender are harmful to all of us because they limit our ability to live full and free lives. So it's not somebody or some community's conversation. It is we all have to recognize the benefits and challenges of the current construction and how we are all harmed by it and how some of us benefit from the current social construction. So that was the part I couldn't say. I knew there was one part. So when we talk about gender, there's three aspects to our gender. We have our gender expression. Our gender expression is about the cues that we're currently able to send. And I purposely say currently able because of safety or for economic reasons. Some of us might not be able to send all the cues we want to send. So for example, cues that I send. I wear pants, I have a beard, I decorate my body, I send particular messages, I act in a particular way. That's my gender expression. Right now, what we have is what we'll call a spectrum of femininity and masculinity. We have a spectrum of femininity and masculinity. I fall what I would call slightly to the masculine side of that spectrum. When people look at me, they often guess correctly that I'm trying to present masculine. And what's true for a lot of folks in community is for a whole bunch of reasons, whether it's economic access, whether it's personal or community safety, whether it's a strategy, folks may not have access to expressing their gender the way they want to. Folks may not be allowed to express their gender the way they want to. Or because contexts change a lot, I just might not always be expressing my gender in ways that feel congruent with my identity. My identity is my sense of self. What do I call myself when it comes to gender? I often call myself a man or a cis man, cisgender. And then gender roles. Currently in our society, we have some mental images of what we expect people to do along the spectrum of femininity and masculinity. Things we might be surprised to see a masculine presenting person doing, things we may be surprised to see a feminine presenting person doing. And part of what happens in our current construction of gender is we decide we know. We decide that by looking at someone or hearing their name, that we know how they should be expressing their gender. We know how they should be defining their gender, and we know what their roles are. And our whole goal in this series is increasing complexity. So we get really focused on, I should know, I should have access to the knowing. And that feeling that we should have access to the knowing is part of how privilege works. And then for any of us who are part of LGBTQ communities, part of our coming out and part of our process is really thinking about how we're perceived. And we're not always staying cognizant of the locations where we need to show up as allies and accomplices. So because we've moved through or are moving through, are fighting for our ability to be free and to exist, we can sometimes be narrow or myopic and forget that we are a part of a broad fabric of people, multiplicity of gender identities who are fighting for gender liberation. When we talk about sex, that's biological. It's about our biology, our chromosomes, our secondary sex characteristics. Mostly at church, biological sex is not super important, save for a couple of scenarios. One, you may be providing support services to people who, because of their biology, experience things like pregnancy, menstruation, breast cancer. So maybe biological sex becomes relevant. As an employer, sometimes biological sex becomes important because you need to make sure that certain health benefits are available. We have this thing we do, which is we kind of jam sex and gender together. So we think we're being progressive on a form or in a survey by saying, please state your gender, and then we give the options of male and female. That's an incorrect question with the wrong set of answers. Male and female are biological sex markers, and there's more biological sex markers than that. Gender is about identity expression and role. So a better question is, tell me the words you use to describe your gender. There are an infinite number of words. So in this invitation of complexity, we want to move away from, could I possibly know all of the different words people might ever use to describe their gender? Here's my example as someone who's been doing LGBTQ plus work for 20 years. I used to run a scholarship program for queer and trans students. Every year in those scholarship applications, I learned, as the person who administered the scholarships, I learned new words for gender and sexuality. So today, I invite you to release ever needing to know or even understand all the words that people might ever use to describe their gender. Your job is to receive and believe. That when the person you meet gives you the words that you're supposed to use for them, got it, and practice using them. Your task of trying to learn all the gender words will always be incomplete. And when the goal is build relationship, create a sense of welcome, work together for justice, it's the receive and believe practice that will help us. Sexual orientation or sexuality, again, 3 parts that we break down. One is identity. What are the words or words you would use to describe your sexuality or sexual orientation? For me, I use the words gay and queer interchangeably. On purpose, in different contexts for different reasons. Attraction. So what is my desire? What do I go toward? What do I feel attracted to? For me, I feel attracted to primarily a masculine presentation. And then behavior. Who have I ever dated? Who have I ever been romantic with? For me, that's been lots of kinds of people for a whole bunch of different reasons. And here's what's true. Those 3 things, much like in gender, might not always be or feel congruent. So what I call myself, who I'm attracted to, and who I'm ever with might not match. And it's less important that people know whether or not they match. And again, what I ask for and what a lot of my community asks for and what a lot of us ask for is welcome us as we are and don't try to jam us into a box, right? And for folks who haven't spent time thinking about their sexuality or sexual orientation, welcome yourself into an exploration of that aspect of identity. Dominant culture attempts to desexualize intelligent adults. I'll say more about that later. So we all have some combination of all of these things. And we're pretty unpracticed in community talking about how they are important and relevant, and additive. So spend some time thinking about your words and your experiences for yourself in terms of gender, biological sex, and sexual orientation. And spend some time with this prompt. You won't be sharing. This will be an internal reflection. What is important about these aspects of identity to your spiritual practice? And what is important for others to know? What is important? What's additive about your gender and your sexuality in the context of church and spiritual practice? What feels additive? And what feels important to you or other people to know? And again, this is just quiet reflection for you. We won't be sharing on this prompt. Spend about 3 minutes with that. So I want to offer now, I want to make more explicit the links between how white supremacy operates and how that informs our pursuits for LGBTQ justice. So the project of identity in the US, as we've discussed before, is around developing a structure of race that's inextricably linked with gender, sexuality, religion, and class. That is about a construction of control. White supremacy said there are more important kinds of people. There's a hierarchy of human value. And as you've heard me say, as that hierarchy was purposefully constructed through the courts in the early colonies, the best kind of human, the highest ranking kind of human, was a white male baby who would go on to procreate. And white males who were procreating were considered the closest to God and therefore most worthy of building wealth. Owning land, owning labor, building wealth. So it was a whole construction of control based on creating borders that said white male government knows best where bodies should be. It was a whole system of control that said white male bodies know better than women what women's bodies should be doing. It was a system of control that said we are going to interpret scripture to say it is our job to take this land, to occupy this continent, and it is our job as it is the job of white male Christians to procreate and fill the land. So that control, that construction it still tries to require some pretty rigid adherence to gender roles. If we adhere to those gender roles, then white supremacy is successful. When we resist and work against those gender roles, white supremacy throws a fit because white supremacy believes it knows when and where and how our bodies should be. And control creates comfort. If, in a construction of white supremacy, I can look at each body in this room and say, I know your gender, I know your pronouns, I know where you're supposed to be, and I know when you're supposed to be, and I know how you're supposed to be, then I can decide how you best make money in the economy. If we can't control the bodies, then the bodies can't be used as tools, as economic drivers. When we reclaim sovereignty over our bodies and self-determination of how we express ourselves, it becomes harder to exploit us as merely workers to drive profit. So white supremacy depends on gender roles so that it can say, you go here and you go here, and you're falling outside of our current expectation of where bodies like yours should be. So it lives inside a kind of certainty. White supremacy demands a kind of certainty that says if we don't have a binary, we might create confusion or discomfort. And if there's confusion and discomfort, we won't be able to control those bodies. Rather than saying, there's an opportunity here to be expansive in how we understand, how we express ourselves, how we share our sexuality, how we build family, how we move through geography. We come back to either or thinking being the common thread of our series. Either or thinking says either you're this or you're that. And if you change who you are, if you change how I'm supposed to refer to you, that's problematic. And you are the one having a hard time, not me lacking the receive and believe practice. When we try to hold each other into rigid boxes of who we are and how we are relative to our gender and sexuality, we say, it's easier for me if you just don't act different. It's easier for me if I know what I can expect of you always and forever relative to your gender and sexuality, rather than saying, I'm committed to the rigorous practice of knowing that I don't know and of being open to a multiplicity of possibilities. Either or thinking contributes to all the ways that homophobia, transphobia, sexism, misogyny harm all of us and limit all of us. Phobia, irrational fear. Homophobia and transphobia come from a place that somehow, because for any of us who identify as queer or trans, that we are a threat. We're a threat to the construction of race and gender. We're a threat to a system of control. And we're a threat to the comfort of feeling like we know everything. So then for anybody who isn't queer or trans, but might want to think expansively about their own gender and sexuality, it limits your ability to be creative in how you express yourself. There's praise and punishment for all kinds of different transgressions when it comes to a gender binary. We talk a lot in our work, that print showed up pretty small. We talk a lot about, in our work, what are the dominant culture patterns that we need to be able to notice and then move away from. So when we think about a community that has shared analysis, what are some of the things that we might consider watching for that we know show up inside of institutions? The first thing that dominant culture does is it assumes that adults are partnered and monogamous. So we oftentimes trade in social capital when we meet folks, and we come from a place of assuming they're in a long-term and monogamous partnership. So we have to catch that assumption that we make about when we meet other adults. It's a very hetero-gender controlled sort of construct. We assume we know how someone identifies. I try to practice, I would invite this practice too, of saying, you know, if it's been some amount of time since I've been with someone, I maybe don't know how they identify. Maybe it's been weeks or months since I've seen them. They may be identifying in a new and different way. We assume we know what someone should be doing and what they should be doing with their body. I look at you, I've assigned you gender, I've assigned you race, I've assigned you class. I've assigned you age, and I think I know where you're supposed to be and what you're supposed to be doing. We assume binary masculine and feminine roles. And even any of us who think of ourselves as expansive in our understanding of gender oftentimes fall back on and rest on gendered tropes. We assume that if adults are in a relationship, that they are finding a way to procreate. We assume that partnered adults want babies and that they want to make biological babies. And this one really messes with our heads. We assume people are procreating, and we assume people are non-sexual. What? And we assume that we have access to femme people's bodies, labor, intellect, and care without resourcing it. So we assume I get to touch and take and learn from and request from women and femmes' bodies without permission and without compensation. We also assume the right to know, and we assume the right to understand. I'm supposed to know all the gender words, and I'm supposed to get all the gender words. So there's a lot there. Some of us feel really close to some of these realities. Some of us are wrestling with them for the first time. Some of us wouldn't talk about these realities in this way, even though they resonate with us. I want you to spend 10 minutes at your table and just reflect what's coming up for you as you listen to this. What's coming up for you as you take this in right now? Spend 10 minutes at your table. So a couple more pieces, just things we want to hold in our awareness. Things that are sort of some of the key takeaways from our work together this evening. We all have gender and sexuality. And part of the way that homophobia, transphobia, misogyny, sexism have worked is we've said the conversations about gender and sexuality are for women, are for trans people, or for queer folks, rather than saying it's a conversation for all of us to be having. White supremacy is about control, and that is limiting. So if we're trying to control how bodies move, how bodies express themselves, how bodies engage with each other, that's limiting our creativity, it's limiting our spirituality, it's limiting our ability to understand how expansive this lived experience can be. Something I haven't said super explicitly, capitalism has tried to sell us a white, wealthy, partnered, and cis narrative of LGBTQ people. So we mostly, less and less, but I would say for the last 20 years or so, mostly in the media, what we get are white coupled gays or lesbians on TV. And there's a bigger picture. And what we know is that LGBTQ people actually experience more economic inequality than our straight and cis counterparts. Trans people in the US are more educated than cis people and paid and employed at a significantly lower rate. More education, less employment, less paid. Lesbian households make tens of thousands of dollars less in annual income than cis male gay households and hetero households. It's the compounding nature of being queer, and if you're out, sometimes harder to get a job, and the fact that we structurally, systemically, and on purpose pay women less. So when your household is run by two women, the earning potential is significantly lower. Receive and believe can be a useful practice, and I think believe is the important part, is that too often we are seen as a threat, we're seen as fictitious, we're seen as amorphous. We see ourselves as unbelievable. There's no vocabulary test. You will never know all the words. Proximity does not equal justice. So we may be near lots of queer and trans people, and we may be reinforcing lots of dominant culture patterns. There is no competition of injustices. That's what the series is about. There's a complexity of injustice. There are multiple intersections, compounding factors that many of us are living at those intersections. And we haven't talked a lot about public policy or political fights right now, but some of us might not be aware of the fact that most of the LGBT rights conversations are policy issues that the political right has chosen. So the political right studies very closely what their voting base is motivated by and what their phobias are, what their irrational fears are. And they do it in really interesting places like Oregon. And Oregon is never not having a ballot measure about folks of color, about queer people, about women's bodies, because they test phobias on the voting base in Oregon. And then they figure out what's going to turn out voters across the country. And when they put LGBTQ people in the public spotlight, they force a conversation about things that we're often not asking for. We're not disinterested or unwanting, but marriage became a policy issue because the right forced it. Restrooms became a policy issue because the right forced it. Drag shows became a policy issue because the right forced it. Primarily, we're trying to be free and unencumbered. Too many buttons. So I know a bunch of folks have done work with the IDI. So for anybody who's done work with the IDI and the intercultural development theory, I wanted to help you understand a little bit about how a group mindset might think about LGBTQ justice. So in the minimization mindset, we're going to be thinking a lot about a vocab list, to do's and to don'ts, like what are all of the transphobic things people say and can I make sure to not say them? And we're really invested in representation. In the minimization mindset, we think I'll feel pretty good if there's lots of LGBTQ people around. In acceptance, we have a lot of interpersonal curiosity. So we're likely to be able to show empathy and interest in people's gender identity and sexual orientation. And we're conversant in structural awareness. So the impact of that capacity in the acceptance mindset is sort of inclusion. Between you and I feel included, I feel welcome. In the adaptation mindset, we're going to shift structure, policy, and process with a focus on outcomes. We're going to look at how do we behave as a church? What are our processes? What are our programs? And rooted in any of our policy and process and programming, are we reinforcing those dominant culture patterns? So said another way, in minimization, we might think things like, it's important we have LGBTQ plus people here in leading. That's not bad or wrong, but that's sort of the extent to our analysis is like the win is there are LGBTQ people here and queer and trans folks are in leadership somewhere. In acceptance, we're posing questions like, how do my and our behaviors show that I and we care about LGBTQ people and justice? So like, ooh, we're kind of looking around like, are there cues or signals we can send? In adaptation, we're going to look at and say, not if, but when do our practices reinforce binary and control? So you'll notice that shift, it's a little bit of a nuance. It's less LGBTQ people are the locus of justice. And in adaptation, we're saying, when do all of us engage in reinforcing binaries of control? What are our goals? When and how do we need to shift? So I want to send you back to your groups. For a last 10-minute conversation. What values and beliefs are connected to your gender identity and sexual orientation? So I'll give you an example. I have a value of being done. And I've been really trying to think about why I go fast and why I really like being done in a professional setting. And I've been thinking about this for a very long time. And I used to joke by saying done is my favorite feeling. Like I checked it off the list and like nothing feels better than crossing something off the list. And I started to think about the fact that that really shows up a lot in how I lead and how I manage as a business owner. And then I started to think about, well, who trained me? Most of my early mentors were men. Most of my managers have been men. And I learned management, I learned budgeting, I learned project planning, I learned finance from cis men, most of whom instilled in me, go fast and be done. Go fast and be done, which isn't about what did you learn along the way? How were people impacted by your process? What relationships were strengthened or developed along the way? So there are no process, or there are no relational goals. It's just, it happened fast and it's done, and that's better than everything. So for me, I've really got to work on this belief that go fast and be done is the best way to be a leader. When and with whom do I notice and name gender and sexuality? So where am I, who am I with? What are the locations? And can I increase the locations where I'm naming the impacts of how we experience gender and sexuality? When and how does either or thinking show up? Emphasizing one aspect of identity, subscribing to a gender binary, desire to control, and more. So engage these questions with your groups for 10 minutes.